Dr. Pollock, you mentioned that on balance you think this is a good deal. Let me just ask you this. Against the original criteria, the goal was to preclude Iran from ever becoming a nuclear weapon state. Against that standard, how would you evaluate this?
Senator, I can only say that the jury is out. We don't know whether or not Iran will become a nuclear weapons state. I think it is going to be difficult and unlikely that they will choose to do so in the next 10 years. And as I said, after that, we don't know. It is a bet after 10 years.
So the question is, are we in a stronger position 10 years from now or a weaker position? And I'm not sure. I think that the 10 years is variable. We all know that. Are we in a stronger position or weaker position relative to the sanctions regime, relative to their economic strength, other developments in the region, and so forth? So the question is, and I agree with Mr. Singh, there are three options today. One is the deal, two is war, three is something we hardly ever talk about here, and that's imagining a doubling down of the sanctions that got them to the table in the first place. Would you address both of those issues for me, please, quickly?
Sure. So I may be one of the first people who actually proposed this whole conception of using the sanctions to bring the Iranians to the table in a book I wrote back in 2004. And I will say that I think that we did reasonably well with it, I think we might have done better. I am deeply skeptical, though, that we're going to be able to hold the sanctions in place if the deal is turned down. And again, I say this with no love. I would love to be able to say to you, absolutely, the international community is with us. Vote down the deal. We will get a better one. That is simply not my analysis of the circumstances.
Mr. Singh, I've had two trips. I've been blessed with two trips to the Middle East, two private meetings with Prime Minister Netanyahu. A couple of us have actually met with 5 heads of state. We had a prime minister, or a foreign minister rather, from Saudi Arabia here just a couple weeks ago. I echo what you both have said already, and that is the overwhelming conclusion that we walked away from those meetings with was that there is tremendous trepidation about what it is our intention is and what our strategy going forward is among our allies. And I'm very concerned that if we go ahead with this deal as a proxy for our relationship with them without telling them specifically what our strategy is, that we create a false sense of security there, and it encourages them to do things that otherwise they wouldn't do. Let me just mention one: Saudi Arabia and Yemen. I mean, that to me is a direct result. Saudi Arabia visiting Moscow just weeks ago, talking about arms purchases. So I'm very concerned about a realignment, if you will, of strategic alliances in the region that are directly driven by a deal that causes more questions than it questions it answers. Mr. Singh?
Well, I think that fear is justified, Senator. I think even before this deal, as many of you senators know, there were a lot of concerns from our allies in the region that we were looking to disengage from the region. Things like the withdrawal from Iraq in 2011, the talk about a pivot to Asia, talk about energy independence. Even if those things were justified, the failure to put them in a strategic context, the failure to assert continued American leadership in the region, the failure to follow up on things like the Syria red line, I think had a damaging effect on our credibility there. And now if you look at what we're doing here, it looks from the outside like a major strategic reversal. So we're going from isolating Iran to now facilitating Iran's re-entry into the international financial system. We're going from sanctioning Iran to relieving sanctions, from opposing their nuclear program to actually assisting, in many respects, their nuclear program. Because we haven't situated that in any articulation of how this fits into a larger strategy, I think the tendency of our allies is to assume that there's some unspoken strategic realignment, as you mentioned. And that's going to be very tough to dispel, especially because, look, if we were relatively inactive against Iran before this deal, now that we have a vested interest in keeping this deal, what's the likelihood or the credibility that we're suddenly going to get really tough? I think folks just don't buy it.
So one of the things that I see as a side derivative, and we don't talk about because we're really trying to figure out if this deal can stop them from becoming nuclear, is the question, what happens with Russia's influence in the region and China's influence in the region? It looks to me like Iran is the conduit through which they improve their relationships in the Middle East relative to where we are today.
I think that's right. I've done a lot of work on the question of the Chinese policy in the Middle East and the Chinese-Iran relationship in particular. And I think China sees Iran as its sort of natural strategic partner in the region. There's a strong economic relationship there that's rests on their oil trade, their energy trade. It's the only place in the Middle East where you could reach the Middle Eastern energy supplies by pipeline, so you don't need to worry about the U.S. Navy in the Persian Gulf. And it's the only country there on the Gulf littoral, which
so
is
let
not.
me, can
Yes,
we, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's a new point of understanding. So what you're saying, there's a possibility in the very near future that Iran will have the capability of precluding our Navy from the Persian Gulf.
Look, it's certainly true, and I don't want to sort of get beyond my expertise on the energy issue, but certainly you see China building pipelines and other sort of land-based energy infrastructure to try to bypass those maritime choke points. And of course, you see Iranian ports being developed outside of the Strait of Hormuz.
I have one other question. What possible reason, and I'll throw this to both of you, I mean, why is the ballistic missile development no later than 8 years from now so important to them? If all they want is a civil nuclear program, there are 18 other countries in the world that have civil programs that do not enrich, that are not allowed to enrich. In fact, there are only 5 that are allowed to enrich who have civil programs that don't have nuclear programs. Countries like Japan, Germany, Holland, Brazil, Argentina. We've allowed Iran to bypass those 18. So I want to go to the ballistic missile. Right now, they've got a series of missiles that they own. They're all mostly short range, but they're developing this 1,400-mile Sajol-2, I guess, missile. They have the Shahab family of missiles. My question is, this ballistic technology, why is that so important to them? That got put in this agreement late, we understand. So why is that so important to them?
Well, look, when you look at a nuclear weapons program, a delivery vehicle, a ballistic missile, is the third leg of that program.
So it really has nothing to do with a civil nuclear program, right?
Well, they'll say that it does. They'll say that it's not a civil nuclear program, but they'll say, no, the ballistic missiles have a non-nuclear, not a non-military, of course, but a non-nuclear use. If you're developing the medium-range missiles, well, that's, for regular warheads. If you're developing an ICBM, no, that's a space launch program to put satellites into space. The difficulty for us, I think, is that as Secretary Carter, I think, said quite recently, an ICBM is one of the most dangerous things that Iran could possibly develop. I don't think any country that doesn't have nuclear weapons has developed an ICBM. And what the agreement does is, while it keeps Iran's ballistic missile program totally opaque, there are no inspections of the ballistic missile program. It lifts the ban on Iran conducting launches, for example. They could conduct a launch, on implementation day, and it's not banned by this agreement. And it removes the sanctions on foreign assistance in 8 years. And if you want to build an ICBM, which is tough, foreign assistance, I think, would be critical.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.